To see that there has been a radical revolution in thought as well as in behavior, just look at the revolution in our language about sexuality. When people use the word morality today, they almost always mean sexual morality. That's a remarkable new development. That's an astonishing narrowing. It's as if we started to use the word state to mean only Russia, or use the word technology to mean only computers. The reason for the new development is, I think, obvious from those two comparisons. Sex, Russia, and computers are where there have been three of the most radical revolutions. No one speaks of a revolution in any other area of morality. Have you ever heard of the property revolution or the bearing false witness resolution? In fact, the rest of the natural moral law is pretty much still in place. Almost no one defends terrorism, sadism, cannibalism, insider trading, nuclear war, environmental pollution, rape, hypocrisy, torture, or murder. We're still judgmental about these things. But if it has anything whatsoever to do with sex, we no longer dare be judgmental. For instance, turn the clock back and look at the non-impeachment of President Clinton. I think no United States president would ever have survived public revelation that he was any of those immoral things I just mentioned, or even a deliberate liar about anything else except sex. Look at abortion. No one defends killing innocent, defenseless human beings except for sex. That's what abortion is. The whole purpose of abortion is backup birth control. And the whole purpose of birth control is to have sex without having babies. If storks brought babies, Planned Parenthood would go broke. Sex is the motor that drives the abortion business. Or look at divorce. Suppose there was some other practice that didn't involve sex that had the same three scientifically provable effects that divorce has. First, it betrays your most solemn promise you ever make to the person you said was the most important person in your life. It's the biggest lie in your life. Second, it was child abuse. It maimed your children's psyches. It made a happy life and a happy marriage and family much, much harder for those vulnerable little people that you brought into the world and who remained largely dependent on you for their future. Third, it infallibly guaranteed that your society would die, would self-destruct, because no society in history has ever survived without stable marriages and stable families. It is the one absolutely indispensable foundation for everything else. For it is the first and most intimate way that individuals form communities and emerge from selfishness. Now, these three things are exactly what divorce does. More than that, divorce is a form of suicide. The suicide of a new person, the two-in-one flesh that is created by marriage. How healthy would you think a society is if half of all its individual citizens committed suicide? But half of our families commit suicide. And if society is composed of families, not just of individuals, well, that's a sick society. But divorce is tolerated and accepted. Why? Because it's about sex. Suppose it was proved that something else, something in no way connected with sex, had these same three effects. For instance, smoking, or single malt scotch, or Ferris wheels. You'd have absolute prohibition, not tolerance. So the moral revolution is confined to sex. We are not allowed to steal another man's money without being put into jail, but we can steal another man's wife. You cannot betray your lawyer without being severely penalized, but you can betray your wife, and she is then usually severely penalized. You cannot kill bald eagles or blue whales without being a criminal, but you can kill your own children as long as you do it 1 second before the two blades of the scissors meet in the middle of the umbilical cord rather than a second after, or a second before the body emerges from the birth canal rather than a second after. What kind of logic is this? Obviously, the mind behind the sexual revolution is not overly attached to logical consistency. So I think there is little hope of changing the mind that defends that revolution by logical arguments, however infallible they may be. You need more than logic to unscramble the brains of an addict. The argument will find no soil in the brains to grow in because those brains are already scrambled. Do you really think that sex addicts can think more clearly than drug addicts? I think it's the opposite. Drug addicts don't usually defend their addiction with elaborate rationalizations and new philosophies of moral relativism. And only about 5 to 10% of Americans are drug addicts. Maybe twice as much if we include alcohol. But the vast majority are sex addicts. According to a recent poll, over 50% of the men who attend church every Sunday are addicted to pornography. That's not 50% of men, or even 50% of Christian men, but 50% of the small elite cream of the crop who are in church every Sunday. It is a literal epidemic. What then do we need to defeat this revolution, which has brought about such immense destruction and eventual death to families and infallibly, eventually, to society? Reason, logic, argument, science, facts, common sense, compromise, return to tradition, none of these are strong enough. What is strong enough? Only one thing. Nothing less than Jesus Christ. Because the heart of the error of the sexual revolution is the identifying of love with sex. And Christ undoes this fundamental confusion by showing us, not just telling us, but showing us what love is. The Beatles are right. All you need is love, but not the kind of love they mean. Why is it true that all you need is love? Because God is love and all you need is God. If you have God plus 10 million other things, and if I have God alone, you don't have a single thing more than I do. Love and the lack of love transforms everything else. Remember Detroit and Hawaii. Christianity centers on two equations. God is love and love is Christ. Look at the second equation. You want to know what love is? Look at Christ. 1 Corinthians 13, the most popular chapter in the Bible, read at nearly every wedding, is a description of Christ. It's not an abstract definition of an ideal. It's a concrete description of the historical fact of Jesus Christ. John Paul II's favorite quotation, Jesus Christ shows man to himself. Without Christ, we do not know ourselves. We are like a dog in a cage at the airport who has chewed off his own dog tag with his name and address on it. He does not know who he is or where his home is. In other words, we do not have an anthropology. That's us without Christ. For he's the mind of God. He designed us for God's sake. I mean that literally, not profanely. He designed us for God's sake. For the God who is love. But what kind of love? A new and different kind. And that difference was so radical that it converted the world. It wasn't theology that converted the world, it was love. Mother Teresa converted souls without number just by being what she was, a saint. An example of this new love, this total love, this godlike love, which was exactly what Jesus predicted would happen. He said, "By this will all men know that you are my disciples, by the love you have for one another." Now, if that love was something already in the world and already known, if it was romance or erotic love or liking or compassion or philanthropy or civility or fairness or justice or mercy, all of which are wonderful things, but if that was all it was, if the love Christ was talking about was not radically new and different, then he could not possibly have meant what he said. It would contradict itself. It would mean the world will see the difference between you and them by the fact that you all share the same kind of love. The world will be able to distinguish my disciples from everybody else by the fact that their kind of love isn't different than anybody else's. It means, of course, exactly the opposite. Our human loves are all forms of desire, need, eros. These need loves are very good things. Men need women and women need men, physically and spiritually and socially and emotionally and biologically. And children need adults and adults need children. And teachers need students and students need teachers. But the love Christ brings is the love God is, and God does not need anything. God is sheer gift. That's why Jesus came and why he died and why he shed so much blood. He didn't have to. One drop would have saved the world. We were already saved at his circumcision. So why did he give 12 quarts? Because he had 12 quarts to give. Now, let's connect this new love, this love that is the very nature of God, with sex and the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution has disconnected sex with love. We need to reconnect it. How? First of all, in our thinking, then in our acting. Because without the right thoughts, we won't do the right acts. Without a roadmap, we won't find the right road. We've already seen that the sexual revolution is a radical change, not just in behavior, but in thinking. And the most radical change in thinking that the sexual revolution brought about is not any addition, but a subtraction. I think the single most radical result of all the immense amount of sex education programs that we have had in the last 50 years has not been a new knowledge, but a new ignorance. In fact, an ignorance of the single most essential thing about sex. The essential meaning and purpose of sex, the very essence of sex. Sex makes babies. They're not accidents. Pregnancy is not a disease. Babies are what sex does if you let it do its thing. Sex makes new immortal persons. Sex is incredibly, magically, supernaturally creative because it images the Creator. It's part of the image of God. That's why the first time the Bible mentions the image of God in Genesis, it immediately mentions sex. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. We moderns think sex is for us. It isn't. It's for our children. We moderns think we're so enlightened because we're not legalists anymore. We're personalists. We think about people, not about laws and rules and commandments. We think of the people who make sex, and we want these people to have fun and be happy, which is fine. But we're so fixated on the fact that people make sex that we've ignored the fact that sex makes people. But we've redesigned it so that it doesn't make people anymore. We've contracepted it. But since that is God's way of creating, we have contracepted God. No official teaching in the church's 2,000-year history, no official document has ever been so hated, despised, ignored, and disobeyed as Humanae Vitae. What's the most unpopular teaching of the church today? Nothing comes even close. It's the teaching of the church about sex that is by far the main reason the world hates it and fears it. For the church is judgmental about our society's addiction, our society's real religion. False religion, false gods can be overcome only by true religion, by the true God. Humanae Vitae was prophetic. The pill was a nuclear bomb. It split the atom of the family by splitting the atom of sex, splitting its pleasure from its fruit, its unitive from its procreative end, splitting sex from life. So how does Christ revolutionize the sexual revolution? Not simply by turning back the clock, not by a new Victorianism, not by opposing religion to sex, but by showing their real and profound connection. What is that connection? It's exactly the opposite of what Freud thought it was. Freud argued that religion is only a poor substitute for sex. Christ shows that sex is a poor substitute for religion. For real religion, that is. A kind of religion Freud knew nothing about. Freud thought love was only camouflaged lust. Christ knew that lust was camouflaged love. If Freud were right, it would logically follow that the more sex you have, the less religion you want. So that happily married people who have a lot of happy sex would become atheists. It doesn't happen. The predictions are not verified. The data falsify the theory. Sexually active people don't automatically become atheists, even in college. The college hookup culture has turned colleges into free whorehouses, a randy man's impossible dream. But even these men and their free whores are not happy atheists. They're neither atheists nor happy. Satisfying their sexual hunger is not satisfying their spiritual hunger any more than it did for St. Augustine. So the evidence seems to point to the fact that God isn't a poor substitute for sex, but sex is a poor substitute for God. But let's be honest, among all the substitutes for God, sex is a pretty darn good one. Why? Because it's an icon of God. Eros is an image of agape. The love between the sexes is an image or icon of the love between the persons of the Trinity. That's the heart of John Paul's theology of the body. Only very, very good things can become addictions and idolatries. Drugs ape mystical experience. Nobody gets addicted to paper clips or worships mud. You can't make a religion out of washing machines, but you can make one out of sex. Sex is close to religion because the ultimate end and center and point of all true religions is a spiritual marriage to God. That's what we're designed for. That's the only thing that will keep us in unbored ecstasy forever. That's what the Bible says. The last event in human history, at the end of the apocalypse, is the marriage between the Lamb and his bride, Christ and the church, God and man. That's the point of human life. Why is sex such a thrill? Because it's close to that. It's one of the few things in life that's very much like that. It's literally an ecstasy. The word means standing outside yourself, ekstasis, self-forgetfulness, self-transcendence. It's an overcoming of that hidden inner loneliness that every one of us brings into the world with that wonderful and terrible little word, I. The I is restless until it becomes a we. And that's ultimately because God is a we. It's not the physical excitement that's the greatest excitement in sex. It's the personal excitement of knowing that this other person has accepted you into his or her inner sanctum, body and soul. The I has become we. It's the we-ness, not the I-ness. When we know that the one we love loves us. When the two streams of loving and being loved meet like two beams of light becoming one. Or two rivers of volcanic lava blending. The two really do become one. And paradoxically, in that one moment, when they are the most totally lost in each other, each one discovers the deepest secret of his or her own individuality. At what moment do lovers attain the peak of their individual fulfillment, if not at that moment when they are the most totally lost in giving themselves to each other? Why does that happen? Because that's what God is. And that's why we're not bored in heaven forever. And that's the ultimate law of life. The grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies. That's the only way it lives. You lose your life. That's the only way to find it. You give. That's the only way to receive. You forget yourself. That's the only way to discover yourself. A kind of mystical absent-mindedness. You can become the other without ceasing to be yourself. Now, there are some other peak experiences in life besides sex that can give you some of that thrill, but they're all similar to sex. Great music, for instance, or surfing a great wave. But I think God designed sex to be the primary way, which is why he didn't design babies to come from listening to Beethoven or for hanging 10 in the tube. In short, by God's design in creating us, we are all hardwired for the spiritual marriage, for becoming one with God. That's why we're so thrilled at becoming one with each other, as the images of God. As we are images of God, the sexual union is an image of union with God, an appetizer of heaven. St. Thomas Aquinas says, no man can live without joy. That is, without ecstasy, which is much more than happiness. Because happiness can be somewhat under your control and therefore boring. But joy is always a gift and therefore always a surprise. Here's the secret of the sexual revolution. Its origin is religious. The revolution could not have happened without the loss of true religion, the loss of spiritual joy, the loss of religious passion, the passionate love of God. The revolution couldn't have happened without that. And of course, without the pill, which allows us to have sex without consequences and lifelong responsibilities. We have thus given up the two deepest, longest, greatest joys, the eternal love of God and the temporal love of spouse and family and children. The two joys that come from the most total self-giving, the radical adventure of holding back nothing. And we've given up those two great dramatic joys for what? For the temporary, shallower and smaller pleasures that are so small because they have to hold something back. Hold back total self-giving, which includes fertility and family and future and commitment. Those are crazy adventures. What a crazy adventure having kids is. And we're therefore bored and unhappy because we're hardwired for that all or nothing, wild, total risk and romance. And all we find instead is cool, controlled kicks. And so we lie. We pretend we are happy. What is our most basic social liturgy? How are you? The answer is fine. Even if your dog just died, your mother-in-law is coming to live with you forever, your kids think you're a dork, and your wife is collecting the phone numbers of divorce lawyers. I'm fine. If we're all fine, how come the suicide rate for teenagers rose 5,000% between 1950 and 1990, according to William Bennett's Index of Social Indicators? What could possibly be a more unarguable index of increasing unhappiness than that? Now, how does Jesus Christ answer that? What does he have to do with the sexual revolution? Everything. Because Christ alone gives us intimacy with God, and that's the thing the sexual revolution is looking for but doesn't know it. As Chesterton said, when the adulterer knocks on the door of the brothel, he's really looking for a cathedral. Therefore, Christ alone is the answer to the sexual revolution, because nobody else gives us intimacy with God. What I've said will strike some people as bizarre. How dare I bring these two things together, Christ and sex? Well, I have to bring them together because they're the two most passionate things in our lives. Because both are revelations of the same God, the God of love. So this, I think, is the main point of the theology of the body, which is the church's answer to the sexual revolution. The church always responds to new heresies with new definitions, new insights, new restatements of eternal truths. And how important is this response? I think it's as important as the sexual revolution. The importance of St. George depends on the importance of the dragon. The importance of Dr. Van Helsing depends on the importance of Dracula. And how important is the dragon, or the Dracula of the sexual revolution? Well, that depends on how important the family is, for exactly the same reason. Because the revolution is doing a Dracula on the family. And how important is the family? It is only the foundation for all human society, and the source of the greatest human happiness, and when messed up, the greatest human unhappiness in the world. Because the family is the image of God. God is not a lonely individual. God is a family. I think the family is even more important to God than doctrinal orthodoxy, because the family is the very image and presence of God among us. Islam and Mormonism are both theological heresies, but they are both multiplying faster than Christianity. Why? I think God is blessing them because Mormons and Muslims today are much more faithful than Christians to their families, to sexual morality, to marriage, and to procreation. George Weigel says the Catholic Church can get its social agenda through Washington very simply. Just kick out every Roman Catholic congressman and replace him with a Muslim or a Mormon. The Muslims tried to conquer Christian Europe for 13 centuries with the sword, and they failed. They are now succeeding because they have discovered a far more powerful weapon than swords: mothers. They're having children and families, and Christians aren't. And therefore God is giving them Europe because they deserve it and we don't. This is outrageous because neither Muhammad nor Joseph Smith is the answer to the sexual revolution. Christ is. He doesn't just teach us the Word of God about sex. He is the Word of God about sex. He is the spiritual marriage. He's the whole meaning and end and point and purpose and consummation of sex and of our whole lives in this world and the next. He's the inventor of sex, the icon. And he's the mediator of the heavenly ecstasy, the mystical marriage, of which sex is the icon. Therefore, to know him is to know the meaning of all things, including sex. Well, there's much more to say about a Christian anthropology of sex, but nothing less will do.